Light is very important thing when we talk about 3D. Light draws silhouette and helps us understand the shape and the depth. But light in spline is not the same as in professional 3D tools, but very close. In professional 3D programs, light not only highlights object but also reflects from them, and these reflections create this realistic feeling. In spline, light interact with objects separately, so if we put to each other two objects with a different color, they will not interact with each other, because there is no light ray tracing logic. But knowing that, how it works in professional 3D, we can imitate this in spline with the materials. So hello and welcome on my spline design course. In this tutorial we will dive deep into the spline light logic. By default, at least on this spline version, we have two sources of light in our scene. The directional light, which we can move or just delete, and the ambient light in the project panel. Ambient light hasn't one point from which this light releases. Ambient is everywhere, it's kinda supportive light. You can also turn it off if you need to achieve completely dark environment and for example achieve effect like this. Here we have completely dark shadows. You can change the color of the ambient light, and for better understanding, I put a few objects in the viewport and then I will change the color of the ambient light. Now we can see how it interacts with our objects. Sometimes you can imitate different white balance. You know, when we make a photo, we can set the white balance. It can be colder or warmer, so sometimes you can set a little bit yellow light to make your scene warmer. However, most of the time you will work with these default settings, believe me. Now let's talk about light sources you can add to the scene and how they work. To add a light, click on the plus icon here and choose light you need. Let's start from directional light. Directional light is a light which shines always directly to the center, so that's why you see this line. It shows you the direction from where this light starts its race. You can understand how this light works based on the shadows, so you see that our cubes has absolutely the same shadows. Directional light doesn't visible on the scene. You have only schematic rectangle and line, which can help you understand where your light positioned. This thing calls helper, and you can always turn it off from project settings panel if you don't need to see them. Also, as any object on the viewport, directional light has their own settings. Click on this object, and in the object panel you can find light section. And here you can change the color of the light so you can imitate any colorful light. Not only white, but of course you will not see any light if you will go to the dark colors. It doesn't work. With intensity, you can manage how stronger or faint light could be. But when we talk about good looking 3D, try to find the perfect balance between light and dark parts, so try to not overlight your scene as well as not overdark it. Directional light works good when you need to show your object material, so remember, if you have any source of light on your scene, you need to work with lighting material layer of your object. Let's talk about another source of light and compare it with the directional light, the point light. Imagine you keep in your hand a small sun, so the light from this sun will spread in all directions. Compared to the directional light, which shines directly in one direction, point light will highlight everything around. So if you put a point light here, you can see how natural it will highlight all my objects in this scene. And you see how natural shadows from our cubes. The position of cubes relative to the light projects a different shadow compared to the directional light. For point light, we also have the color option and intensity options. But compared to the directional light, as because the light starts from the center and endlessly spreading in all directions, we can set the distance of the point light, how far it will shine. Also, we have a decay, which I recommend you just don't touch. Point light could be used when you need to imitate a source of light, like a lamp, bulb, or any abstract source of light, like in this scene. And the last for this moment source of light is a spotlight. Spotlight works like a handled flashlight. While shining, it creates a line round spot on the surface, just like a flashlight. It's a pretty specific source of light on spline, and maybe not so popular, but with this type of light, you can achieve an effect like this. So let's try to understand how this light works and which options it has. When you put this light first, you will see this giant helper. It shows from where and how the light spreads. So now it's shining down. Let's move up this light object. Now we see how this light works, but for better understanding, I will add this little 3D flashlight icon, so when I will rotate this flashlight, we will see the position of the light spot. The spotlight is only one of the types you can really rotate, because in case of direction and point light, rotation will not provide any result, But with Spotlight, it's the same as rotate a flashlight in your hands. With rotating, you will direct your spotlight where it should shine. The Spotlight also has a color and intensity in settings, and the distance, like the point light. But also, it has an angle and edge blur option, which can help you make the beam of light wider or narrower, smoother or sharper. We also can see how different lights create a different shadow. And shadow is important as well as light. One doesn't exist without the other. And for good look in 3D, we need to have a good look in realistic shadows. In Spline, in the project panel, where the light section, you have a shadow display in mode: low faster, normal, or high slower. Low faster mode highly increases the performance, but shadows will look ugly, while high slower will make your shadows better, but it can afford performance as well. So if you plan to embed your 3D scene into the web, better to use low faster mode. It helps your scene work better. But if you're gonna export your scene as an image, you can select high slower. But I recommend you at least working on your scene in low faster mode and switch it to the high slower right before you will ready to export your scene. So this mode helps us to achieve smoother shadow, but not only this mode. In light settings, we also have some options for shadow. For the directional light, you can, by the way, turn the shadow off at all, probably for some special situation. Then you have resolution. Look at this at the shadow quality. With Huge, it will look better. Penumbra works better when we have shadows at an angle, so Penumbra option will try to blur shadow in a more realistic way. Not just blur all shadow, but blur it when the shadow disappears at sides. Sometimes we can have some objects which actually shouldn't cast a shadow to the other objects. So you can select this object, and in the inspector panel you can turn off the shadow cast as well as receiving. Working with light in Spline can sometimes remind how photographers set the light for their scene. So it could be a nice skill if you be able to reuse the light setup from photographer's scene to the Spline scene. Here is one of these examples of how to achieve pretty nice and realistic light picture based on the light setup of photographer's scene. So we need to not just highlight this object, but also with light show the depth and make a feeling of realism. Start from main line, as because I have only one object in the center, I will choose the directional light, and I will position this light to the front top left side, so I will have an oblique lighting, which is quite natural. I also set light at this value, because less light intensity will make my object too dark, and super intense light will make it too overlighted here. Now I'm gonna add a contour light to highlight the silhouette of the object and also separate my object from the background. For the contour light, I also will use directional light, and I will put it behind my object, opposite to the main light. After a few adjustments, I received this. I'm not a photographer, and I'm also not a professional 3D designer, but when I look at this, I feel it natural and satisfied. So I use this pretty simple light setup scheme. At least one source of light in front of the object and another highlights the back. And the last thing, to make it more realistic, I need to have shadow in place like here or here. To do that, I can turn on the ambient shadows. So ambient shadows create shadow between shapes when they are close to each other, for example between objects and floor. So let's say the ambient shadow is a shadow from the ambient light. This shadow also quite resource demanding, so I recommend you to turn it on when you plan to export your scene as an image. Here you can manage how strong this shadow could be and also change a color and render quality. This shadow will increase the realistic feeling in multiple times, because this shadow also feels natural. In Spline, light is not only one light sources. I mean, we can achieve the effect of light without using the light sources at all. Remember this example from previous video where I showed this sphere, which hasn't light, and lighting material layer was turned off. We think there is a light because we imitate light and shadows. What is light in this scene? Our object is a gray, the light is white color, and the shadow is a dark gray color. So in Spline you can draw light and shadow using materials layers. For example, I can put this sphere which will imitate a source of light. So I will make it white. Then I will put another sphere, and I want to show how this sphere will interact with this source of light. I will use depth to create this light and shadow map on my sphere. Also good example here, where I have a sphere with cloner, and using depth material I can imitate light inside the group of spheres. Also, I can use a matcap material to have a nice material without light. If you plan to work with the simple shapes, but you need to make it realistic, use matcaps. Creating a scene without light source could be quite useful because it will help you optimize your scene if you plan embed it to the web, because the more light you will have, the heavier your scene will be, and the loading time will be bigger. A few tips before we finished. Be careful with light. Try to not use a lot of light sources, or where and when it's possible, not use it at all. Setting perfect light in the scene as a separate skill, so you can learn more about how to set the perfect light in a scene from photographers or videographers or references from the internet. Do not over-illuminate or darken your object too much. Now you know how many light options we have in Spline, what we can do with this light, and how we can manage shadows. See you in the next tutorial.